All right, we continue to look at the structural damage caused by the inclement weather conditions. We're joined now by Professor Adesola Ilemobade from the Wits School of Civil and Environmental Engineering. Good evening, Professor. Thank you very much for joining us on the program. Now, the inclement weather has left a trail of destruction. 6 people we've heard there lost their lives. All of these developments again necessitating a conversation around climate-resilient infrastructure and whether a rapid response can be effected within the parameters of South Africa's environmental legislation. So, firstly, your reaction to the level of devastation we've seen in government's response.
Thank you, Mfundo, and hello to your listeners. I listened in on the previous conversation and just expressing condolences to families that are faced with the tragic losses of lives within their families and just the tragic loss of property and so on happening in different places within our country today. And yes, unfortunately, the rainfall we've experienced over the last few days have created quite a discomfort for some and tragedy for others. But this rainfall patterns are not going to subside into the future simply because our development is creating more and more impervious surfaces in our urban areas, which then translates to increased runoff, which then has the impact on downstream communities such as what we're seeing in eThekwini.
Mm-hmm. And then as for government's response, how do you believe they've fared so far? Because we've just had that really at this point, there hardly is any capacity, but they're doing the best they can.
Well, it's very difficult to comment and place a one-size-fits-all on government's response because it's really varied depending on the capacities of the different municipalities responding to localized flooding, major flooding, and tragedies at different places. Mm-hmm. One thing is critical, that the response must be immediate, but it must be sustained. It cannot simply be a response on the basis of the current emergency that we are seeing in different communities. There must be a sustained response from our different government departments to how to deal with this inevitable recurrence of flash floods and extended periods of rainfall that are inevitably going to result in flooding at our downstream communities.
I suppose we can speak extensively a bit later on the response activities to reconnect the communities, especially under the parameters of the current legislation. But let's just delve deeper into the poor land management practices and expanding development that have somewhat compromised natural protective flood attenuation.
Well, thank you for that. It is so as civilizations, we typically develop where we choose, and what that means is that we interfere with the natural water cycle.
Yeah.
That is reigning in the different catchments where we develop, and the water cycle really speaks in basic terms to how water moves within a catchment, from rainfall to runoff, infiltration. The runoff is into our surface water bodies. Sometimes we get infiltration into our groundwater aquifers, and then you've got evaporation, you've got transpiration into the atmosphere, and that cycle recurs again and again. And what we are seeing, or what we've experienced over the last 4 or 5 days, is the water cycle responding to development within different catchments. In this case, it's a larger water cycle, so it's a more regional water cycle, because what we've experienced is cool moisture from the tropical Pacific moving across Botswana into South Africa and forming clouds and precipitating on the land masses in the areas in South Africa, or the provinces in South Africa that are experiencing rain currently.
Now, Professor, you say we tamper with the water cycle just because of the poor decisions that we make as to where to develop. But that's why we have engineers such as yourself. So why are your expertise or services not always utilized in this respect?
Well, that is not the case, Mfundo. You see, development must happen. You and I must have a home to live in. We must put in place transportation systems for people to travel, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, what then results from that development is we increase impervious surfaces within the catchments where we're developing. And cities are the places where a lot of people can find employment, can find services, and so people flock to your urban areas, and urban areas have to then compensate for the increased migration into their different jurisdictions. So it is in the developmental process that we are challenged to ensure that our development does not impact nature as significantly as it does.
And I suppose significantly being the operative word here. So meaning to a certain extent it is inevitable. Then it brings us to the conversation about then building climate resilient infrastructure then.
Yes. Well, the approach in this case, which is stormwater management, is trying to design infrastructure that mimics nature. And what we've done in the past in many of our communities is a common enemy approach, which is that when the rain falls, we see runoff as a common enemy. So our infrastructure is built in such a way that it conveys the runoff very quickly from our living spaces downstream. And what then happens in that case is that the runoff then becomes destructive to communities living downstream. So, for example, the Yoske River flowing through Alexandra creates a lot of tragedy during times like this because Alex is located downstream of the Yoske River. So building or designing and implementing climate resilient infrastructure means we must rethink how we put together and how we build infrastructure. We can start looking, and many communities and many institutions are doing this currently, where green roofs are implemented over flat roofs in high-rise buildings, low-rise buildings, constructed wetlands, vegetated swales. These are all nature and vegetative solutions that provide a reprieve and mitigate some of the challenges with increased runoff and very destructive runoff in downstream communities.